The message was smaller than her hand, but by nightfall it might decide whether an entire corner of Warsaw would be found in time or left waiting in silence. Aniela Kowalska was 16 years old, though in the cellar beneath a cracked apartment house in August 1944, age had become almost meaningless. Warsaw had changed the faces of its children. It had taught them how to whisper, how to listen through walls, how to recognize a safe knock from a dangerous one, and how to carry fear without letting it choose their direction. Above her, the city was no longer the Warsaw she remembered from school mornings, crowded markets, church bells, and winter streets. It had become a maze of courtyards, stairwells, blocked avenues, hidden passages, temporary hospitals, and rooms where maps were drawn by candlelight because the old routes could no longer be trusted. Aniela, known to the others as Anka, was not famous, not decorated, and not the kind of person history usually stops to name. She was small, quick, and quiet, with brown hair tucked beneath a dark scarf, a worn coat hanging loosely from her shoulders, scuffed shoes, and a canvas bag crossed tightly over her chest. The bag had carried bread, bandages, notes, spare socks, and once a pair of cracked eyeglasses wrapped carefully in cloth for a teacher trapped several streets away. But this morning, it would carry something heavier than all of those things, though it weighed almost nothing. Captain Pyotr Nowak stood at a table made from 2 wooden crates and a loose door. He looked like a man who had slept in fragments and measured every hour by what could still be saved. His face was narrow, his dark hair untidy, and his white and red armband had faded at the edges from dust, sweat, and constant use. Around him, radio operators, messengers, nurses, and home army volunteers moved through the cellar with controlled urgency. Nobody wasted motion. Nobody raised their voice. Panic was a luxury the city could not afford. On the table lay a map of Warsaw marked with pencil lines, crossed-out streets, cellar routes, courtyards, medical points, and districts that had begun to feel like separate islands. Somewhere beyond those lines, a temporary hospital was waiting for instructions. Somewhere beyond them, people needed medicine, water, a safer route, and proof that the rest of the city still knew they existed. Captain Nowak folded a small message once, then again, until it was no larger than a matchbook. He sealed it inside a strip of cloth and looked at Anka for a moment longer than necessary, as if he were silently asking whether Warsaw had any right to place this much responsibility on a girl. But the city had already asked too much of everyone. It had asked nurses to work with too little, families to live beneath their own apartments, and teenagers to become the thin moving line between one isolated district and another. Anka held out her hand before he could reconsider. The captain placed the cloth-wrapped message in her palm. Its lightness almost frightened her. Something this important should have dragged her hand downward. Instead, it rested there quietly, a folded piece of paper small enough to disappear inside the lining of her coat, close enough to her heartbeat that she would feel it with every step. Captain Nowak gave the route only once. She was to leave through the rear cellar, cross the courtyard with the broken pump, avoid the wider street, past the old bakery, find the nurse at the temporary hospital, then continue toward the command post before dusk. If the street route failed, she was to use the cellars. If the cellars failed, there was a sewer entrance beneath a damaged tram shelter, marked by a chalk sign no larger than a thumbprint. He did not say what would happen if every route failed. He did not need to. Anka nodded, slipped the message into the hidden seam of her coat, tightened the strap of her bag, and climbed toward the cellar door. Behind her, Captain Nowak bent over the map again. Ahead of her, Warsaw waited like a city that had already changed its shape. She stepped into the dim light with one thought repeating inside her. The paper was small, but its weight was growing. Anka left the cellar through a rear passage that smelled of damp brick, old coal dust, and cabbage soup someone had stretched across too many bowls. The door closed behind her with a soft wooden click, and the sound felt larger than it should have, as if the whole building had taken notice that she was now carrying something that could not be replaced. For a moment, she stood in the narrow service corridor behind the apartment house, letting her eyes adjust to the gray light. Warsaw was above her, around her, and beneath her at the same time. It no longer behaved like a city with a center, a river, neighborhoods, schools, shops, and streets that led where they were supposed to lead. It had become a puzzle rebuilt every hour by smoke, dust, barricades, missing walls, whispered warnings, and the decisions of people who had learned to survive by opening the right door at the right second. Anka touched the hidden seam of her coat. The message was still there, flat against her ribs. It was small, but its weight was growing. She crossed the courtyard with the broken pump, just as Captain Nowak had told her, keeping close to the wall where the shadows collected under laundry lines that no one had bothered to take down. A woman in a headscarf looked at her from a basement window and gave the smallest nod, not enough to attract attention, only enough to say that the way was open. Anka nodded back without slowing. A courier who stopped too often became a question, and questions were dangerous in a city where every stranger might be frightened enough to speak carelessly. The old bakery stood at the corner, its sign hanging crooked above a doorway half covered by boards. Before the uprising, Anka had once waited there with her mother for rye bread, pretending not to stare at the warm loaves behind the counter. Now the smell of bread was only a memory, and memory could slow a person down if she let it. She moved past the bakery and into a passage between two buildings, where the bricks scraped the sleeve of her coat and the canvas strap cut into her shoulder. Somewhere ahead, the wider street waited. She knew she was supposed to avoid it, but the city had changed even since the route was given. A courtyard gate that should have been open was chained from the other side. A stairwell that should have led into the next building was blocked by fallen plaster and furniture stacked as a barrier. Anka paused only long enough to listen. In Warsaw, listening mattered more than looking. Looking told you what was in front of you. Listening told you what might be coming, what had just passed, and whether people nearby were calm enough to trust. Behind one door, someone whispered a prayer. Behind another, a child asked for water, and an older voice answered with a tenderness that made Anka look away. She could not carry every need she heard. She already carried the one need placed in her hands. She found a narrow side entrance and slipped inside a dark hallway, where a chalk arrow had been drawn low on the wall near the floor. It pointed toward the next courtyard. The sign was old, perhaps from another courier, perhaps from yesterday, perhaps from an hour ago. In ordinary times, a chalk mark meant nothing. In August 1944, it could mean a way through the city, or it could mean someone had forgotten to erase a route that no longer existed. Anka followed it anyway. Her world narrowed to small decisions. Step over the broken chair. Do not touch the loose railing. Keep the bag in front. Do not look too long at the family sitting beneath the stairwell. Do not ask whether they had seen the nurse unless there was no other choice. By the time she reached the next building, sweat had gathered under her scarf even though the air was cool. She could feel the message when she breathed. The route was already bending away from Captain Nowak's instructions, and that frightened her more than the distance itself. A memorized path was a promise. A changed path was an argument with time. At the end of the hallway, an elderly man opened a door before she knocked, as if he had been waiting for the sound of her steps. He looked at her armband, then at her face, then down at the bag across her chest. Without asking her name, he pointed toward a low opening cut through the wall into the neighboring cellar. Not the street, he said quietly in Polish. The street is no longer a street. Anka thanked him with a whisper and crouched toward the opening. Behind her, the old man closed the door. Ahead, the next cellar swallowed the light. She thought again of Captain Nowak bent over the map, of the temporary hospital waiting for instructions, of the nurse she had not yet found, and of the paper hidden close to her heartbeat. Warsaw had already changed, but the message still had to arrive before dusk. The opening through the wall led into a cellar so low that Anka had to bend her shoulders and move sideways, one hand against the bricks, the other pressed over the seam of her coat where the message rested. The air was colder there, trapped beneath the building with the smell of damp wood, dust, and stored potatoes that had long since become more valuable than coins. A candle burned near a crate, its flame protected by a chipped glass jar, and in that small circle of light, 3 women were sorting strips of clean cloth with the solemn care of people handling something precious. They looked up when Anka entered, but no one asked her business. In Warsaw, a girl moving quickly with a bag across her chest did not need to explain herself unless the path ahead was closed. One of the women pointed toward a narrow passage behind a hanging blanket. "To the courtyard," she whispered. "Then down again. Do not use the stairs to the street." Anka nodded and kept moving. The city above her seemed to press down through the ceiling, but beneath it another Warsaw existed, stitched together from cellars, laundry rooms, storage spaces, broken walls, and the quiet trust of strangers. It was not on any official map. It changed with every hour. A door that opened in the morning might be blocked by afternoon. A safe courtyard could become useless before dusk. A chalk mark could save a life, or lead someone toward a route that had already disappeared. That was why couriers mattered. They carried not only messages, but the newest version of the city itself. Anka slipped through the hanging blanket and crossed another basement room where a boy younger than her sat beside a bucket, holding a cup with both hands. His eyes followed her bag. She wanted to tell him she was bringing help, that the note near her ribs might help reconnect the temporary hospital, that somewhere a captain was waiting to turn paper into action. But hope could be dangerous when spoken too early, so she only gave him a small nod and continued. The next passage brought her into a courtyard choked with dust and broken plaster. Sunlight entered unevenly between the walls, pale and harsh after the cellar darkness. She crossed quickly, counting her steps, because Captain Nowak had told her that time mattered more than pride. At the far side, a woman opened a door before Anka reached it and pulled her inside by the sleeve, not roughly, but with the urgent efficiency of someone who had done the same for others all day. "Courier?" the woman asked. Anka nodded. "Hospital?" Anka nodded again. The woman's face changed. Not with relief, exactly, but with the look of a person who had been waiting for a thin thread not to break. She guided Anka through a hallway and down a short flight of stairs into the temporary medical station. It was not a hospital in the way Anka remembered hospitals from before the war. It was a schoolroom, a cellar, a storage room, and a prayer all forced into the same space. Desks had been pushed against the wall. Blankets hung for privacy. Basins, folded cloth, bottles, handwritten lists, and cups of water sat on tables that had once held lessons and homework. Nurses moved between people with quiet discipline, their faces tired but steady. No one wasted a bandage. No one wasted a word. Anka found the nurse Captain Nowak had mentioned near the back, a woman in her 30s with dark hair pinned badly beneath a white scarf and sleeves rolled to the elbow. Her name was Zofia, though Anka had only heard it once before, whispered in the cellar network as if names themselves had to travel carefully. Zofia looked at Anka's coat, then at her bag, then at her face. "You came from Nowak?" she asked. Anka touched the hidden seam but did not remove the message. "I have to continue to him," she said. "This is not the final stop." Zofia's expression tightened because she understood what that meant. The message was still traveling. The line was not yet restored. She reached into a notebook and tore out a small page covered with careful writing. "Then take this too," she said. "Medicine needed, water points, and the number of people who must be moved if the route opens." Anka hesitated. One message had already felt heavy enough. A second made the mission feel larger than her body. Zofia folded the page, wrapped it in another strip of cloth, and placed it in Anka's palm. "Tell him we can wait a little longer," she said, her voice low. "But not forever." Anka looked around the room, at the basins, the blankets, the lists, the people lying quietly with faces turned toward any sound that might mean news from outside. She had carried letters before. She had carried instructions, passwords, warnings, and names. But this was the first time a message seemed to breathe through the people waiting behind it. She tucked Zofia's note beside Captain Nowak's, close to her heartbeat, and promised she would try. It was not a grand promise. It was the only honest kind. Then she turned toward the next door, knowing that the paper was small, but its weight was growing again. Anka left the temporary medical station with 2 messages hidden inside her coat and the feeling that the city had placed another hand on her shoulder. The first note from Captain Nowak had been heavy because it carried instructions, routes, and orders that needed to reach the other side of Warsaw before dusk. The second note from Nurse Zofia was heavier in a different way. It carried numbers, medicine needs, water points, and the quiet reality of people waiting underground with no clear promise except that someone might still be trying to reach them. Anka had expected the mission to become harder because of distance, but now it was becoming harder because of meaning. Every step away from the medical station felt like walking away from faces that had trusted her without really knowing her. She moved through the next hallway with her palm against the wall, counting door frames in order to stay steady. A courier could not afford to become emotional in the open. Emotion slowed the feet, made the eyes linger too long, made the mouth answer questions better left unanswered. So she carried the fear the way her mother had taught her, close, quiet, and never in charge. At the end of the corridor, a home army volunteer waited, beside a door with one hand raised. He was younger than Captain Nowak, but older than Anka, with dust on his hair and a white and red armband wrapped tightly above one sleeve. "Not through the courtyard," he whispered. The route changed. Anka felt her stomach tighten. Routes had been changing all morning, but this was the first time someone said it as if the city had closed another gate directly in front of her. The volunteer pointed to a narrow stairway leading down. "People are moving below. Follow the cellar line until the old laundry room. After that, ask for the tram shelter. Do not trust the street signs. Some are gone, and some no longer mean anything." Anka nodded, but for 1 second she hated how calm she looked. Inside, she wanted to ask how many routes were left, how much time had passed, whether Captain Nowak had moved, whether the chalk mark beneath the tram shelter was still there, and whether anyone truly knew the city well enough anymore to guide her through it. Instead, she adjusted the canvas bag across her chest and went down the stairs. The lower passage was crowded now. Families moved in small groups, carrying bundles tied with cloth, kettles, blankets, and framed photographs wrapped in towels. No one hurried openly, because panic could turn a narrow cellar into a trap of elbows and fear, but everyone moved with the same silent understanding. The place they had trusted an hour earlier might not protect them for the next one. Anka slipped between them carefully, keeping her coat closed with one hand. An old woman touched her sleeve and asked if the hospital was still open. Anka wanted to say yes with certainty, the kind of yes that could hold a person upright. But certainty was another thing Warsaw had taken away. "They are still working," she whispered. Nurse Sophia sent a list forward. The old woman closed her eyes for a moment, as if those words were not enough, but still better than nothing. Anka continued. The cellar line led through a storage room, a coal room, and a passage cut through bricks so roughly that she had to turn sideways to pass. In one apartment basement, a man had chalked arrows on the wall, one toward water, one toward the medical station, one toward the sewer route. The arrow toward the street had been crossed out. Anka stopped at the marks, memorized them, and then wiped dust from her fingers onto her coat. The paper was small, but its weight was growing. It was no longer only Captain Nowak's message. It was Zophia's list. It was the old woman's question. It was the families moving below ground because the city above could no longer be trusted to stay the same. By the time Anka reached the old laundry room, the air was warm and close, and her throat felt dry. A boy near the doorway offered her a tin cup with an inch of water left inside. She shook her head, then changed her mind and took one careful sip. Even courage needed a mouth that could swallow. From beyond the laundry room came the faint echo of footsteps and low voices. A guide was waiting there, a thin man with a lantern covered by a cloth. He looked at Anka's armband, then at her coat, then at the place where her hand guarded the hidden seam. "You are going to Nowak," he said. It was not a question. Anka nodded. The man lifted the lantern slightly, just enough to reveal another chalk mark on the wall, a tiny sign shaped like an open doorway. "Then the city has run out of easy paths for you," he said. "From here, you go toward the tram shelter. After that, you go down." Anka looked past him into the passage where the light ended. For the first time that day, she understood that Warsaw was not simply making the mission difficult. It was narrowing her choices until only the darkest road remained. She pressed her hand against the hidden messages, breathed once, and stepped forward. The guide led Anka through a passage so narrow that the covered lantern brushed the wall and left streaks of yellow light across the brick. He moved as if he had counted every step before, but Anka knew better than to trust confidence in a city that kept changing its mind. She followed with one hand against the hidden seam of her coat, feeling the two folded messages beneath the cloth. Captain Nowak's note lay closest to her ribs. Nurse Sophia's list pressed beside it. Together they seemed to have become warmer than her own skin, as if the paper had absorbed the breath of every person waiting behind her. The passage ended beneath the remains of a stairwell, where a small square of daylight opened above them. The guide stopped before climbing. "This is where the old route begins," he whispered. "If it is still open, you will cross behind the tram shelter, follow the bakery wall, and reach the next cellar line." Anka looked up at the pale light. The words should have comforted her, because the tram shelter was part of the route Captain Nowak had given her. It meant the map in the cellar had not been entirely wrong. It meant the city had not yet erased every instruction. But when the guide lifted the hatch and peered out, his shoulders stiffened. He did not speak at first. Silence, Anka had learned, could be more frightening than bad news because it left the mind to invent too many endings. At last he lowered the hatch halfway and turned back. Not that way. Anka felt the air leave her chest. The shelter? She asked. He shook his head. The open way is gone. People are moving away from the street. If you try it, you may not reach the other side before dusk. He did not describe what he had seen, and she was grateful for that. There were things Warsaw understood without needing to name them. Above them, the familiar route had become unsafe, not because a sign had changed or a door had closed, but because the city itself had shifted again. Anka wanted to be angry at the map, at Captain Nowak's careful pencil lines, at every adult who had said the route only once because there had not been time to say it twice. But anger was another luxury. The messages did not care whether the route was fair. They only needed to arrive. The guide pointed to a lower corridor where the floor slanted into darkness. There is another way. Cellars first, then a drainage passage, then the sewer line if the side door is blocked. It is slower. It is harder, but it may still lead toward Nowak's sector. The word sewer settled between them like a cold object. Anka had heard stories from older couriers, not the dramatic kind told to frighten children, but quiet warnings shared by people who had come out pale, silent, and older than when they went in. In the sewers, streets disappeared. Direction became memory. A wrong turn could steal hours. Water could ruin paper. Echoes could make a person think the way ahead was full when it was empty, or empty when others were near. She imagined the two notes inside her coat softening, smearing, losing the words that had made them matter. She pressed her hand harder against them. The guide noticed. Wrap them higher, he said. He handed her a strip of oilcloth folded inside his pocket. Anka stepped into the corner, turned slightly away, and carefully removed the messages just long enough to wrap them together. She did not read them. A courier did not take what was not given. She only protected it. When she tucked the bundle back inside the hidden seam, it felt thicker, less like paper, and more like a small sealed heart she had been ordered to keep beating. Above, footsteps moved across the floorboards of the damaged stairwell. Below, the darker corridor waited. For the first time since leaving Captain Nowak's cellar, Anka allowed herself to admit that she was afraid. Not afraid in the childish way she remembered from thunderstorms or dark rooms, but afraid with a clear mind, afraid because she understood exactly what could be lost. If she turned back, the hospital would keep waiting. If she chose wrong, Captain Nowak might never receive the list, the route, or the proof that people were still holding on in the separated district. If she hesitated too long, dusk would arrive before she did. She thought of Nurse Sophia saying they could wait a little longer, but not forever. She thought of the old woman asking whether the hospital was still open. She thought of Captain Nowak's face when he had placed the first message in her palm, as if he were apologizing without words. Then she tightened the strap of her bag until it no longer swung at her side. "Show me the lower way," she whispered. The guide lowered the lantern toward the slanted corridor. Its weak light revealed wet bricks, broken plaster, and a line of chalk marks leading down into the dark. Anka took one last look at the blocked path above, the route she had known, the route that had died before she could use it. Then she stepped away from daylight and followed the harder road beneath Warsaw. The lower road beneath Warsaw did not feel like a road at all. It felt like the city had been hollowed into narrow breaths, each passage leading to another space where light arrived late and sound behaved strangely. Anka followed the guide down the slanted corridor, stepping over broken plaster and loose boards, careful not to let the canvas bag swing against the wall. The lantern in his hand was covered by cloth, so its glow reached only a few feet ahead, enough to show wet brick, chalk marks, and the uneasy shine of water gathered along the floor. Behind her, the daylight faded until it became only a memory at her back. Ahead, the corridor bent lower, and Warsaw seemed to close around her. She had moved through cellars before. She had crossed courtyards, listened through doors, carried notes past people who never asked her name. But this was different. This was not simply moving under buildings. This was leaving the city she could recognize and entering the city beneath the city, where direction had to be felt through walls, remembered through warnings, and trusted even when every instinct wanted to turn around. The guide stopped at a junction marked by 3 chalk lines. One line pointed toward a storage cellar, one toward a drainage tunnel. One had been smeared by moisture until it looked like a pale scar on the brick. He frowned, and that small change in his face frightened Anka more than the darkness. This mark was clear yesterday, he said. Yesterday. The word felt useless. Yesterday belonged to another Warsaw, another map, another promise. Anka looked down the passages and felt the first real break in her courage. Not fear, not caution, not the dry mouth she had carried since Captain Nowak placed the note in her hand, but something closer to emptiness. The route above had failed. The tram shelter was no longer safe. The chalk marks below were fading. Dusk was still coming, whether she found the way or not. For one moment, she imagined turning back to Nurse Sophia with the messages still hidden in her coat, admitting that the city had become too broken to cross. She imagined the nurse's tired eyes, the old woman's question, Captain Nowak's map, and the temporary hospital waiting for instructions that would never come. The thought made her place both hands over the hidden seam of her coat. The oilcloth bundle was still there, firm and dry, pressed close to her heartbeat. The paper was small, but its weight was now the only thing keeping her from floating backward into surrender. The guide listened down the left passage, then shook his head. "We need the contact room," he whispered. "There may be someone who knows the new route." They turned toward the storage cellar, where the ceiling dropped so low that Anka had to crouch. Twice she slipped, catching herself against the wall. Once the lantern went nearly dark, and for a few seconds all she could hear was water moving somewhere nearby, and her own breathing, too quick, too loud. Then a thin line of light appeared under a door ahead. The guide tapped 3 times, waited, then tapped once more. A wooden panel opened, and a woman's voice asked for the day's password. The guide answered. The door opened just wide enough for them to enter. Inside was a small communication room built from scraps of order. A table held a hand-drawn map, a cracked cup of pencils, candle stubs, folded messages, a field telephone that looked tired from too many hands, and a radio set covered with cloth. 2 Home Army volunteers sat beside it, and between them stood a nurse Anka recognized from the temporary station. It was not Zofia, but one of her assistants, a pale young woman named Maria with a bandage roll looped over one wrist like a bracelet of duty. Maria saw Anka and immediately understood that she had come from the medical station. "You have Zofia's list," she said softly. Anka nodded, too relieved to speak. Maria did not ask to see it. Instead, she bent over the map and pointed with a pencil. "Do not take the old drainage tunnel. It turns you toward a blocked exit. Use the narrow passage here. Then follow the sewer line until the wall marks shaped like a cross and a door. After that, climb at the second iron ladder, not the first. The first brings you out too. Far north." The words entered Anka like air after a long time underwater. Not safety, not certainty, but direction. That was enough. Maria poured a small amount of water into a cup and handed it to her. "Drink, then go slowly. A rushed courier gets lost faster." Anka drank, and the water tasted faintly of metal, but it steadied her. Maria reached into a drawer and gave her another strip of oilcloth. "For the messages," she said. "And for your courage, if you can wrap that too." Anka almost smiled, but it did not quite reach her face. She adjusted the bundle inside her coat, tightened the seam, and looked once more at the hand-drawn route. The contact room, with its candles, radio, pencils, and exhausted volunteers, felt like proof that Warsaw had not completely fallen silent. Beneath the broken streets, people were still drawing lines, still passing names, still helping strangers find one more door. Anka stepped back into the passage with the guide beside her and Maria's directions fixed in her mind. Hope had not returned as something bright or easy. It returned as a route, a mark on a wall, a cup of water, and the knowledge that the message was still dry. Maria's directions became the new map inside Anka's head. The narrow passage, the sewer line, the wall mark shaped like a cross and a door, the second iron ladder, not the first. She repeated each piece silently as she followed the guide away from the contact room and back into the underground dark. The cup of water had steadied her, but it had not made the road easier. Hope in Warsaw was never a wide-open gate. It was a mark on a wall that might still be there when you reached it. It was a stranger who knew one safe turn. It was a message kept dry inside a code, when every path seemed designed to erase it. The guide stopped at the edge of the sewer line and lifted the covered lantern just enough for Anka to see the low tunnel ahead. "From here, you count for yourself," he whispered. "I go no farther. If I leave this post, the next courier may not find the way." Anka wanted to ask him to come anyway. The wish rose quickly, almost like a child's wish, and she buried it before it reached her mouth. She had not come this far because every step had been easy. She had come because each person had carried her only as far as they could, and then placed the rest of the distance back into her hands. She nodded. The guide touched 2 fingers to his armband, then pointed toward the tunnel. Anka stepped forward alone. The darkness received her without ceremony. She kept one hand on the wall and one hand against the hidden messages. The bricks were wet beneath her fingers. Her shoes moved carefully through shallow water, and every sound seemed to return to her from a different direction. The city above was distant now, reduced to faint tremors, muffled echoes, and the deep sense that thousands of lives were continuing somewhere beyond the ceiling of earth and stone. She counted her steps. 20, 40, 60. At 80, she saw the first mark, a chalk line almost washed away. At 110, the tunnel split. She stopped, listened, and remembered Maria's pencil tapping the paper map. Not the wider branch. Not the passage where the air moved colder. The narrow line. Then the mark shaped like a cross and a door. Anka turned right. For several minutes, there was nothing but breath, brick, water, and the steady pressure of the messages against her ribs. Then her bag strap caught on something sharp in the wall. The pull was sudden enough to turn her shoulder. She froze. The canvas had snagged, and for one terrible second she imagined the seam tearing open, the oilcloth slipping loose, the paper falling into the dark water where no order, no list, no plea, and no route could survive. Slowly, carefully, she backed up until the strap loosened. Her hands were shaking, but she forced them to work. She adjusted the bag, tightened the knot she had made earlier, and pressed the hidden bundle flat again. The paper was small, but its weight was now almost unbearable. It was Captain Nowak waiting over a map. It was Nurse Sophia's list. It was Maria's cup of water. It was the old woman asking whether the hospital was still open. It was every door that had opened for her and every door that had closed behind her. She moved again. At last, in the weak beam of the lantern, she carried now in one hand. The mark appeared, a cross beside a rough square like a little doorway. Relief came so sharply she nearly forgot to keep quiet. Beyond it, the tunnel rose slightly. She found the first iron ladder and passed it, though her tired legs begged her to climb. "The first brings you out too far north," Maria had said. Anka kept going until the second ladder appeared, half hidden in shadow. She climbed slowly, rung by rung, with the messages pressed between her coat and her body. At the top, she lifted a small hatch only an inch and waited. Silence. Not peace, not safety, but the kind of silence that allowed a decision. She pushed the hatch higher and pulled herself into the dim back room of a ruined shop. Dust floated in the late afternoon light. Dusk was closer than she wanted it to be. Across a narrow street stood the building where Captain Nowak's new command post was supposed to be, but the space between looked too open, too exposed, too quiet. Anka crouched behind the doorway and watched. She could wait for a better moment, but time was no longer generous. She could turn back, but there was no back left that mattered. She could stay hidden and protect the message forever, but a message protected forever was the same as a message never delivered. She thought of her mother's voice. Carry fear, but do not let it choose. Then Anka tightened her coat, held the bag close, and crossed the final stretch. She did not run wildly. She moved low, fast, and silent, counting each step until she reached the opposite door. A hand pulled it open from inside. Someone whispered her name as if it had been expected and feared at the same time. Anka slipped into the hallway, breathless, soaked at the shoes, dust across her coat, both hands still guarding the hidden seam. At the far end of the cellar, under a hanging lamp, Captain Pyotr Nowak stood over another map, waiting. Captain Pyotr Nowak looked up from the map, and for a moment no one in the cellar moved. The room was larger than the first command post, but felt smaller because too many people were waiting for one answer. A radio operator sat with headphones pressed to one ear. Two couriers stood near the wall, their coats buttoned tight, ready to be sent before they even knew where. A nurse leaned over a table of supply notes. A candle burned beside a chipped mug, and its light shook each time the air moved through the broken window frame above the cellar stairs. Anka stood in the doorway, breathing hard, her shoes wet, her scarf loosened, her coat stained with dust from the passages beneath the city. She had imagined this moment many times during the journey. In some versions, she ran forward and placed the message in the captain's hand with perfect calm. In others, she arrived too late, or found the room empty, or discovered that the city had shifted faster than she could move. But the real moment was quieter than any of those fears. She simply stood there, one hand still pressed against the hidden seam of her coat, as if her body had not yet understood that the carrying was over. Captain Nowak crossed the room in 3 quick steps. He did not ask why she was late. He did not ask which route she had taken. He saw the cellar dust on her sleeves, the wet marks at the bottom of her coat, the tightness in her face, and understood enough. Anka, he said softly, and the use of her name nearly broke the careful wall she had built around herself. She reached inside the seam and withdrew the oilcloth bundle. Her fingers moved slowly because they were cold and stiff, and because some part of her was afraid that after everything, the paper would somehow be ruined. But when she opened the cloth, the folded notes were dry. Captain Nowak took the first message, the one he had given her before morning had fully turned into day. Then Anka placed Nurse Sophia's list beside it. From the temporary hospital, she said. Medicine needs, water points, and people who must be moved if the route opens. She said they can wait a little longer, but not forever. The words changed the room. Not loudly. No one cheered. No one made the moment larger than it was. But everyone leaned in, because the paper had arrived carrying more than orders. It had brought proof that the isolated medical station was still working, that Zofia's people were still organized, that the route beneath the city could still connect one district to another, and that silence had not yet swallowed the spaces between them. Captain Nowak unfolded the notes on the map. His tired eyes moved quickly from line to line. He marked one point with a pencil, then another. The radio operator removed his headphones and waited. The nurse beside the supply table began copying Zofia's list before anyone asked her to. One courier stepped forward when Nowak pointed toward the cellar route Anka had used. Another was sent to confirm the water point. A third was told to find 2 volunteers who knew the lower passages well enough to guide a small group before night. The message had become action. Captain Nowak looked once more at the route Anka had described, and only then did the full meaning of the mission settle over the room. The message had not reached him because the city had become easier to cross. It had reached him because a 16-year-old courier could move through the kind of Warsaw that no official map could show. The Warsaw of cellars, chalk marks, broken courtyards, hidden doors, sewer ladders, nurses, old women at basement windows, and strangers who opened a passage for only a second before closing it again. A larger group would have moved too slowly. A grown man carrying visible authority might never have passed through the narrow spaces unnoticed. Someone without Anka's memory, patience, and silence would have been lost when the familiar route disappeared. That was why this small paper had needed her. Not because she was fearless, but because she could keep moving while afraid. Now the note changed from a secret into a decision. The hospital would be reconnected first. Water points would be confirmed. The lower route would be marked again. Couriers would be sent before dusk. The isolated district was no longer only a blank space on the map. Because Anka had crossed the city, people who had been waiting in silence could finally receive an answer. Before the next group left the cellar, Captain Nowak gave Anka one more task, though this time it did not require her to cross the city. He asked her to tell the route back as clearly as she could, every turn, every mark, every place where the air changed, every door that opened, every passage that had failed. Anka stood beside the map with her wet shoes leaving small dark shapes on the floor and repeated Maria's directions. The second iron ladder, the chalk sign shaped like a cross and a door, the storage room, the contact room, the old laundry passage, and the people moving below ground because the streets could no longer be trusted. As she spoke, the captain drew the city again. Not the Warsaw printed before the war, but the Warsaw that had survived beneath the broken one. A living map of cellars, nurses, couriers, water points, hidden doors, and hands reaching from one district toward another. That was what a teenage courier carried in 1944. Not only paper, not only orders. She carried the latest truth about a city that changed faster than ink could dry. When the next couriers left with copies of Zofia's list and instructions for the hospital route, Anka watched them disappear through the cellar door and understood that her mission had not ended when she handed over the message. It had become part of a chain. Someone had guided her from the first cellar. Someone had opened a door near the bakery. Someone had warned her that the street was no longer a street. Zofia had trusted her with the medical list. Maria had corrected the underground route. The guide had brought her to the edge of the dark. Now others would carry the next pieces forward. That was how an isolated city resisted silence. That was the hidden truth of her journey. The message mattered because Warsaw had been cut into fragments, and fragments cannot survive unless someone carries meaning between them. In another kind of war story, the important object might have been a weapon, a flag, or a command shouted across a battlefield. But here, the object was a folded note protected inside the coat seam of a teenage girl. It carried a route, a hospital list, water points, and proof that people on the far side of the city were still alive in the memory of those who had not yet reached them. It changed what Captain Nowak could do next. It turned uncertainty into a plan. It turned silence into movement. It turned an isolated hospital from a rumor into a responsibility. And it proved why the youngest couriers of Warsaw mattered so deeply. They could pass through the broken shape of the city when others could not. For Americans today, that is why this story is still worth remembering. It reminds us that history is not only changed by the people whose names become famous. Sometimes it is changed by someone young, frightened, and almost invisible, carrying one small message through a burning city because someone on the other side still needs to know they have not been forgotten. In a century filled with maps and armies, one small message could still prove that a city was alive.